Nick Foster is a writer and designer, and you probably have interacted with a few of the companies he's worked for: Apple, Google, Nokia, Sony, Dyson. And he is the author now of a new book called Could, Should, Might, Don't: How We Think About the Future. Nick, welcome to The Gist.
Hello there, Mike. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's very important to note, and I don't have a copy to hold up, but if I did, it would be this bubbly green font. And I take it that you selected that because the future is always rendered in purple and blue, and you wanted to have the exact opposite of that kind of washed out, cliched future imagery.
Well, one part of that is true, that the future is always rendered in purple and blue with some sparkles usually at the moment. Yeah, but I can't take much credit for the cover. That was designed by the wonderful Rodrigo Corral, who's a highly esteemed book designer and graphic designer all around. But yeah, I wanted to try and avoid some of the usual tropes of the kind of book about the future that you might expect somebody like me to write.
Yeah. And why would, when, I don't know, maybe this is true, maybe this is not, maybe a publisher approached you, and I would imagine they'd say something like, oh, the guy from Google X, the guy who designed Loon, if you could put your thoughts down, and maybe we'll have a blue and purple book, but people will buy it because they'll be so jazzed to find out about all these great new inventions that you have in your brain. I don't know if that was the pitch, but that's not the book. And tell me why you didn't want to write that kind of book.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, so I left Google X in 2023, and I just had a lot, I've been working in the future space for 25 years or more, and just had a lot of stuff silted up in my brain, lots of half thoughts, lots of little half ideas. And I've always found writing a good way to get those things in order. And I think I never sort of set out to write a book. It just sort of happened. The ideas got longer, the paragraphs got longer, they turned into chapters, and eventually we had something book shaped. And I think when you meet somebody who says I don't use the term futurist, but if you meet somebody who is a futurist, there's typically two things that people expect from a book like that. One is either some form of manifesto or making a case for a particular type of future, or this is what we should be doing. Right. The second is more of a sort of methods book with some sort of internal diagram or system that you can scroll on a whiteboard at work and say, here we go, we're doing futures today, and here's my 5-step method that I can, gush about on LinkedIn or something. And I deliberately didn't want to do that. I wanted to take a step a bit further back and just talk about the process of thinking about the future, like what goes on in our brains and why do we reach for certain things. And, we can talk a little bit about why I think that's important, perhaps.
Well, the book or the idea where you list 5 things, thought starters, insights that you have gleaned from your decades-long career, that is definitely the sort of thing that businesses want from you. I'm sure you did a version of this training for other people who worked in Google many times, and you have that in you. But I want to know, why did you want to write it in this format rather than, well, was it an act of rebellion, or was it, I think I'm sensing that there is just having read the book, that you critique that format, that other way of doing it, where I'm going to give you ways to think about the future and you're going to be inspired and you're going to come back because I've unlocked in you some ability to imagine that you didn't imagine before. I sense that there's a critique in that way of thinking that is how the future actually comes about.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation, Mike. I do like to push back on status quo. I find that, aside from the fact it's quite fun, I do find that a provocative and useful thing. But maybe the reason why I'm interested in doing this book right now is because I think thinking about the future is more important now than perhaps it ever has been. And I mean that because we're sitting on top of just this massive pile of change. And we're all sort of struggling to conceive of what the future might hold, because change feels like it's coming faster and in greater magnitude than it ever has in the past. And so I wanted not to put just another book with a wibbly wobbly arrow and a light bulb on the cover, sort of saying, this is the future that's coming and you need to be prepared, or here's my method. Right. Because I think we need a reassessment, actually, that none of us, I'm a designer, I've worked in tech, but none of us is particularly good at thinking about the future. And what I mean by good is rigorous, well-balanced, detail-oriented, tenacious, long-termist. I just don't think we don't learn how to do that at school. We all tend to find ourselves falling into one of these four pots that I've isolated and sort of ignoring or diminishing the other three. And I think we're all living in the sort of accidentally planted time capsules that our previous generations just sort of dropped on us, and we're dealing with those things now. And I think there's this feeling that we need to stop doing that, and we need to start thinking more rigorously about the future and what we might be setting in motion. And so I wanted to not say the future I desire or here's how to do it, but just to start and crack open that conversation a bit and saying, hey, this is a skill that none of us are particularly adept at.
So could is the realm of the designer, let's say, or could is the realm of the inventor. Should is the realm of perhaps the philosopher, the ethicist. This might be the realm of the actuarial expert, and don't is the realm of the scold, and the scold could come from academia, or could come from religious portions of our society. Tell me about how they all interact.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously 80,000 words worth of detail here we could go into, so I will skip through them. But yeah, you're right. I think there are these. What I want to be really careful about here is saying one is better than the other. They each have their own benefits, and they each have clearly their own drawbacks. And I think the point that I'm trying to make here is they're perhaps representative of caricatures that sit in the corner of the map. And by pulling out those caricatures, we can perhaps understand the territory a bit more. And so whenever we find ourselves talking about the future, we can start to say, oh, hang on, am I being a bit shouldist here, or am I being a bit mightist here? And maybe I need to sort of broaden my approach. Or more importantly, actually, is I want the general public, everybody, to sort of become a better critic of the futures that are pitched to them and shown to them and sold to them, and say, hang on a second, this feels just like a piece of strident don't futurism. And what I want to hear is more like, well, what should we do? Or what might we do? Or what could we do? And so drawing out these pots is not to say this is the one I think is best. It's just to say I think these extremes exist, and we need to be aware of where they're good, where they're bad, where they come from, and you know, when we might find ourselves doing one more than the others.
You write a lot about the effect of sci-fi and sci-fi imagery in convincing us what the future will be like. Of the sci-fi images of could, should, might, and don't, which ones do they mostly play with?
I think I define could as very, very driven by science fiction. Don't has some science fiction influences too. You know, things like Frankenstein and Brave New World and Handmaid's Tale are sort of pieces of science fiction that tread into dystopia and places we don't want to go and things we don't want to happen. But I think when I talk
where'd you put David Bowie in there? Which chapter was he in?
I can't remember David Bowie being in there. I don't know. Good point. I think where I would classically say, like when you type something like future or futuristic into Google image search, you get a lot of what I call could futurism out of there, which is very sci-fi inflected, the same sort of humanoid robots, the flying cars, the kind of crystal cities, the imaginaries of science fiction come through very strongly in there. And it's what we also see at things like CES, you know, the Consumer Electronics Show. It's what we see from our kind of on-stage futurists at conferences, these big, bombastic, energetic, sci-fi inflected, ambitious versions of the future. The challenge with that kind of work is it's very heroic, as is sci-fi. It pitches the future sort of over there somewhere rather than an evolution of the present. And it therefore feels like sort of fantasy or advertising even, sort of this aspirational future place that somebody has presented to you. And the challenge that I have with a lot of could futurism is it's incredibly repetitive. It seems to pride itself on its imagination and its sort of bombastic ambition. But if you go to Google image search, I encourage anyone to do this right now and go type the word futuristic or the future. It's a really sort of repetitive, homogeneous, purple and blue, flying cars, you know, future cities, scenes from Blade Runner.
Big glass towers.
Yeah, it's the same sort of stuff. And it's very...
in very thin steeples with birds flying around the upper heights.
Yeah. It's very, very repetitive, which sort of runs counter to it. It presents itself as this ambitious future visionary stuff. And I think one thing to mention as well is, having been around Silicon Valley now for 13 years, being in tech for 20 plus, science fiction and science fiction imaginaries have really found themselves deeper and deeper in the kind of lore and ethos of big tech companies. So I used to work at Google X. All of the meeting rooms were named after sci-fi robots, for example, like R2-D2 and HAL 9000. Small things, but they nurture culture and say, this is what we care about and this is what we think is important.
Yeah.
Microsoft's assistant is called Cortana, which is a character from Halo. OpenAI named their recent project Stargate after the Roland Emmerich sci-fi movie. So these sorts of, and obviously Elon Musk is a huge sci-fi fan, and his rockets are called Falcon because, Star Wars. And I find that this actually represents a sort of substitution for real, deep, rigorous, original thinking. And I've been in meetings with scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, investors, who, when we're talking about the present day, they want very, very detailed empirical thinking, actual facts about whatever it is we're dealing with on the table. But as soon as the conversation moves into the future, they start mentioning the Jetsons and Minority Report and the Matrix. And it's just sort of this gap that really troubles me about good futurism, this like fantasy land of sort of futuristic sci-fi imaginaries.
I've thought about this so much, but one thing I didn't think about until you just mentioned it. There must be dozens, if not 100 employees of Google named Dave, and when that guy gets assigned to the HAL 9000 room, I mean, it must be hell for him. I'm sorry, everyone making the joke, and I'm sorry, Dave.
I was on Spotify the other day. Star Wars soundtrack came on, and the progress bar turned into a lightsaber. Again, these are just small little witty things, but it sort of nudges culture. If I ask my Google Home outside, like a question about HAL 9000, it'll give me a sci-fi inflected answer back that's sort of an Easter egg programmed into these things. And so this culture of science fiction is sort of a misreading of science fiction too, which doesn't actually aim to predict. It aims to sort of deal with the ethos of where we might be going and the mythology of technologies, as opposed to saying this is a brief,
It doesn't aim to predict, but I've always heard that sci-fi writers, because they're not working on a linear assignment, are actually in some ways better at predicting than futurists. Robert Heinlein has a pretty great track record from everything from, cancer cures to microwave ovens.
Yeah, I think I'm a prediction skeptic. I think, I grew up. So this is maybe a nice segue into what I call should futurism, which is built around this knowledge of, or this belief in a destination or a truth somewhere out there in the future. And we used to use animal entrails and eggs and following the stars. And I grew up, Nostradamus was everywhere when I was a kid. I don't know why, but his predictions were everywhere. Seemingly, like they pretended he had a great track record. He didn't. He was just vague. And I think that version of prediction, when people meet me and they find out what I do, and sometimes like they hear future or whatever in my bio, and the first thing the first thing they assume is that I adore science fiction. The second is they want a prediction. What's happening? What's going to happen here? What's this going to do? And I think people that make predictions often make an awful lot more than we know, and we just focus on the ones that hit the bullseye.
That's also true of the don't futurists. There's a lot of Cassandraism, and she's not always right.
Absolutely. And I think in more recent terms that we don't tend to use entrails and the movement of stars to make investments at the moment. But what we do use is, the world of kind of corporate strategy. We use a lot of that sort of the taking of historical data and the projection of it forwards to a kind of point in space and say, this is going to happen because this is what's happened in the past. I think we see an awful lot more of that as not necessarily, we don't frame it as prediction, but it's sort of the same ambition to drop a flag somewhere 10 years hence and say this is coming and this is where we should be. And I think the point that I struggle with this type of futurism is when the solid line turns to a dotted line, it ceases to be data. It's a story at that point. And we don't like to think of it as a story, but it is a story because anyone that's followed the stock market.
And we're storytelling animals. And I always thought it would be a good exercise, and you do some of this, to ask, well, forget what's going to happen in 2100 or 2200, or to get there, instead of generating our purple and blue cities, ask, well, what did 1800 think about 1900? And then look at what was going on in 1900 and figure out what 1800 got wrong. You take a whole bunch of different dates. What did 1950 think about 2000? There's a lot on the record. What they get wrong, why'd they get it wrong, what was the main problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up, 1985 was a pivotal year for me because of Back to the Future. And as somebody that says I'm not really a sci-fi fan, that might seem a bit odd, but I feel like that's more of a gadget picture than a sci-fi movie. And
right.
That 2025 is 10 years beyond the future in Back to the Future, yet it feels kind of mundane and ordinary and everyday and normal to me. But because it's sort of piled up over time, and a lot of things have remained largely the same. And I think when we talk about
a very important thing, I love this concept. What do you call it? Accretionism?
Accretion, yeah.
Oh, this is what all the future people don't grapple with. That in those big cities of the future, if that's going to be St. Louis, the arc will be somewhere in that picture and it'll be small to just give scale. But like, what about the whole rest of the city? What about the train station? What about everything else that was there before? It's not just going to be subject to clearance. Yeah. And the people and the ideas they have and how they go about their lives. The future takes with it the past.
Absolutely. It's like sedimentary rock. It just sort of piles up. And you know, we're living in a world now where I have a phone in my pocket that's more powerful than all of the Apollo space program computation. But I also have coat hangers and keys to the front door and, you know, toilet roll and, you know, all of the normal things that sort of haven't really changed for 20, 30, 50 years. And I think when we talk about the future, it's very easy to think about it as this sort of singular thing. But actually all around it are a billion other things that it will interact with and that will interact with it. So when we see things on a plinth at a trade show, a new future thing, try and take it out of that place and put it in Bob and Margaret's kitchen and think about, you know, the sur la table, desk set, whatever they've got next to it, and the plant pot and the thing they inherited from their grandparents, you know. That's the way I like to think about the future.
Toilets are fascinating. Toilet paper. That if someone does a sci-fi comedy, I've never seen toilet paper of the future addressed. That's fascinating.
I think. Sorry, just to add, I think there are occasionally pieces of science fiction or future fiction that do this quite well. So Blade Runner particularly is known as being a good piece of science fiction. Yes, it's an interesting story and it's well executed and some good ideas. But I think one of the reasons it succeeds is because it's kept some of the past with it. It rains there. There's garbage. There's ratty old leather jackets. There's bits and bobs that have sort of endured the change. And the same thing with Black Mirror as well. Yes, it embraces a near future world where there's new technologies, but there are still kind of bad dinners, ugly jumpers, like ordinary bedrooms, ordinary things going on. And I think when we think about the future, thinking about it as a grounded, ordinary, everyday place with liquor stores and 7-Elevens and trash, garbage, stuff around, I think that's when we start to say, oh, this is going to be like my hometown. This is going to affect me and people like me.
Well, not to be overly dystopian, garbage and 7-Elevens, but acoustic guitars, right? I mean, every musical instrument in the future is Cy Snoodles in the Star Wars band, but we love the acoustic guitar or the mandolin or the violin. These haven't changed in hundreds of years.
Things change, but more stuff stays the same.
Yeah, and that's not always bad. Rich people and funders versus poor people and just the people living. Is it actually the case that the rich and the people who are paid to think about the future are the ones who define the future? Because I've never heard a futurist. I've never heard someone who works a 9-to-5 and is middle class talk about a futurist. But I think they have a great say in the future, a greater say than they're given credit for.
Yeah, and this is something that I'm, very aware of. I'm a white middle-aged man, and I work in this very privileged position. And I think typically long-term thought about the future has been part of only the largest and most successful companies because it doesn't have very many KPIs or ROIs. It's very difficult to quantify. So it's often seen as sort of a luxury for when you've got a lot of money, a lot of spare capital, a lot of time to consider and think about the future. So it is restricted to the most successful companies with that kind of budgetary freedom to invest in this sort of stuff. Most people just spending their day trying to get to 5 o'clock and get through the list of to-dos. So long-term thought about the future, firstly, is relegated to those kind of companies, but also culturally, I think it's very sort of, it traditionally has been very kind of city-based and secondary education-based. But that's not to say that there aren't thousands of really interesting, useful, good, broad, diverse ideas about the future. Everything from Afrofuturism to some of the stuff we're seeing out of sub-Saharan African futures. There are lots of different voices that I think, again, in the spirit of trying to make rigorous stories about the future, integrating more points of view into the conversation will yield more of our sort of potential future scenarios of where we might all point. So I do feel I'm very much a product of that level of privilege, and I'm very aware of it. The challenge I have with some of these sort of emergent forms of what you might call niche futurism, but that's probably too denigrating to what it is it doesn't tend to integrate well into the larger ongoing flow of things. I'd love to see some of those ideas coming through Facebook, coming through Google, coming through these sort of big privileged companies, but they tend to stay either willfully or by design on the exterior, offering kind of counterpoints as opposed to integrating those ways of thinking. I know that's not necessarily straightforward, but I do think that that's a step that would be interesting for us to try and take more.
Why do you think dystopian science fiction is so popular? A dystopian frame, the don't frame, is so attractive these days?
I mean, it is attractive, and I think for good reason. There's a lot of stuff that people are really struggling with, and there's this, I grew up in the 1980s. The future was an amazingly positive place for me in the 80s. My father grew up in post-war UK. The 50s was a very sort of positive futures mindset. That isn't the future that our youth feel today. And there's this term in the book, which is ambient adolescent apocalypticism. I can't remember who coined it, but this general feeling that the future's coming and our youth are not excited by it. They're mostly fearful or terrified of it. And it's not just the youth, a lot of us feel it. And so I think we're finding a lot more people starting to veer towards these ways of thinking. And the future seems an absolutely foreboding and terrifying place to a lot of people. Because of the amount of change and the amount of disruption and the sort of lack of alternative stories that have depth and believability and viability in them, that people are really struggling to wrap their arms around anything to hold on to that feels exciting or good or positive. And I think that's a question of balance again. I think, again, one of the problems with, I love, don't futurism within design is really growing. There's an awful lot of sort of responsibility, acknowledgement of the implications of the things we're making, of the secondary and tertiary knock-on effects of the things we're introducing to the world. And this next generation of creative people are certainly very much more attuned to that than I was when I graduated. And I think there's this field of critical design, speculative design that's really growing and starting to breed that sort of, and it's more than just corporate social responsibility. It's actually saying, if we're going to start this thing, let's think about it in its entirety. Let's not just think about how it's launched, but how it lives and how it dies and what happens afterwards and the whole arc of impact of the things we're starting in the world. So I do think I understand where a don't mindset comes from, a sort of fear of the future or wanting to push back against it and a sort of, that don't mindset. I think it needs to be translated into so what are we going to do? How are we going to give people alternative stories to get their arms around?
Yeah, it is true. And I think a lot of it has to do with just the logic and economics of storytelling. I don't know if I want to say economics, think about this. You are a person, you are a storyteller, and you want to write a story that shows something about the human condition. If that something is takes the form of romantic comedy, why would you ever set it in the future? If it takes the form of, just take a great movie that came out last year, very human, A Real Pain. Jesse Eisenberg goes to Poland with his pain-in-the-ass cousin, Culkin.
Kieran.
Thank you. Jesse Eisenberg goes with Kieran Culkin. Why would you ever set that in 2050, right? So, because it's very human. You don't want to get in the way of it. But if you do want to make a point about probably something dystopic, you will set it in the future. So there's a disincentive to portray the future in a way that will reflect how the future actually is, because the future will be so much or have so many elements of the present that it just makes sense in terms of budgets and not confusing the audience to set that story in the present.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's funny that we have movies about the future. That's a thing. They are movies about the future. We don't have movies sort of about the present. They're about things going on in the present, but they're not actually physically pointed at the present.
Movie? I have this great idea for a movie.
Is this a pitch? Are you pitching?
Yeah. I don't know. Do you have ability to greenlight a movie?
We'll see.
I've never given this one away, but I actually think it could be a series. The first 2 episodes are really weird, choose a genre that's popular, cop show. But all these things are wrong about it, and people are like all the cops are, I don't know, they're eating steak at their desk and eating meat all the time and playing football. And then by episode 3, it turns out that it is a period piece that was originated in the year 2075 about the year 2025. So we get to see all the things that the future gets wrong in depicting the past. That's my pitch.
Yeah, I think I'm down. Where do I send my $100 million? I think that's fun.
I think that's in front of the right people.
That is quite funny. You know, now I'm getting towards 50 in February. Feel free to send a card. As I get towards 50, I'm starting to realize I've already lived through a few eras. And when we look back at sort of futures work from the 80s and 90s, we all sort of laugh and think, oh, so silly, so quaint. And we look at how their silly little goggles and their funny little wearable computers and all of that. And we forget that in 2075 or whenever it is, people will look back on what we do now with the same level of sort of derision and comedy that we do to that work.
Yes.
You know, every nightclub in the world has a 1980s night where people go and they sort of dance ironically to Rick Astley and wear kind of fluorescent clothing. And in the future, those same nightclubs will have 2020s nights where people will make heart emojis with their fingers and dance to Kendrick in sort of ironic.
I always make my fashion choices in the present with that in mind. What is going to look stupid in the future? I'm a very conservative dresser. I remember when people were popping collars in the 80s. I'm like, I can't. This is gonna look stupid in 20 years.
No, I think that's the thing, though. We do forget that time is a continuum. We all live within a very small window of it. And when we look forwards, we make the same mistakes as when we look backwards. And we need to start having a conversation about this temporality of our lives and what we're going to do about it, because we're so short-minded and nowist. We're really struggling to start thinking at kind of epochal level. Yeah. And I think it's going to be a critical necessity of all of us to get better at doing this.
You have the concept of, there is this concept of background players and non-player characters, and you point out most of the future is not about the heroes. We think it's about the heroes. It's about everyone else. Keep that in mind. We're all actually non-player characters. It's a great idea, and I was thinking about that when I was thinking about this idea that there are the utopianists. What's the future going to be like? It's going to be great and everyone's going to be happy. There are the dystopianists. We've talked about them. But what these frameworks forget is that these will be humans in the future. And humans are frail cultural creatures. So even if things improve, objectively speaking, just like particulate matter in the air has decreased by 95% and almost no one is dying of lung diseases that they did even 75 years ago, and no one knows it, but we do fret about how Spirit Airlines, instead of saying, well, I could go across the country for $115 or the equivalent. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that we are as human beings, we are very frail cultural creatures, and whatever great innovations that we have, I do think the shouldists and the mightists forget the fact that it's going to affect our psychology. And even if we are connected with social media, it's going to have these costs of making us feel bad about not keeping up with fashion, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are very malleable creatures, and we're pretty good at integrating major change. I think that's one of the reasons why our species has been so dominant, that even when massive either cultural, technological, biological change comes our way, humans have proven to be very adaptable. You know, through the pandemic, yes, it was a major moment of upheaval, but quite quickly we learned how to sort of live with it. Most of us did. The people in the middle of the bell curve, let's say, managed to sort of live with it. We created home offices. We learned how to bake. We had distanced happy hours. We're able to integrate change in a way that goes from amazing to sort of mundane and everyday very quickly. So there's an example in the book about Waymo self-driving taxis, which are now a thing in San Francisco and, around the US. And the first time you get in one, it does feel like, whoa, this is quite something. The second time you get in one, you sort of don't really think about it. And it just becomes very kind of like, yeah, I get this now. And you start to look out the window and you start to look on your phone at where you're going to go for lunch or whatever. And that sort of isn't how we talk about the future. We talk about it with this sort of wide-eyed abandon of like, whoa, this is amazing, filled with sort of heroes doing amazing work. And actually, most people will just sort of be a little bit late for a meeting, or, need to go to physio for their twisted knee, or that's sort of life. Even if we're surrounded by societal, cultural, technological, political change, people exist within those worlds, and we need to dive deep into those relationships and those human stories.
All right, I want to ask you, I think, 3 random questions. 2 are about knowing what you know, apply your framework to a common way of thinking about the future, a common question, and then I want to ask you about one of your projects. Did you hear the interview or hear about the interview between Peter Thiel and Ross Douthat of the New York Times?
I did not.
So in the end, Thiel articulates why he's really worried about the Antichrist figure. And, he makes his case. You could call the Antichrist whoever you want, but it's someone who believes in one government, and he thinks that we're right now more susceptible to that sort of figure being a major problem for us. I was thinking of, he got made fun of a lot because of the language he used. If you use Antichrist, you maybe seem like not exactly in step with current cultural trends. But what about that? What about worrying about one big charismatic figure ruling us all or suppressing us all? Does that, from your could, should, might, don't framework, can you analyze why that thinking goes on?
I mean, it's probably right on the edge of my limit of understanding about sociology and human behaviors. But I do think that the times that we live through are a symptom of the people that are living in those times. And I think at the moment, given, like I said, the amount of change that humanity has gone through, 100 years ago, the average life expectancy in the US was 55, and we didn't have penicillin. And so we're sort of feeling this general feeling of instability. So when we have characters come into that instability who say kind of confrontational things, it kind of adds to that instability. And I think it grows that character perhaps into a caricature. And I think sometimes we're at risk of saying, jumping on the don't bandwagon a little bit heavily and saying, this is terrible, this is against every ideological norm that I hold true. And I think that can take us down some fairly unhelpful avenues. Now, am I saying I agree with everything Peter Thiel says? No, but I think there's definitely a tendency to be drawn towards extremes at the moment, and I don't know exactly why, but I do feel it happening.
Using the could, should, might, don't framework, help me think through the best ways to think through worry about AI, because it's transformative. It certainly represents a lot of possibilities, both good or bad. And sometimes I go to the MIT, they have a site where they put forward the writings of their internal publication. It's 90% worrying about AI, and I almost tune it out. But some of them are going to be right. I just don't know how to know what to take most seriously and what to say. This falls into a tradition of, I don't know, over worrying or under worrying. So that is my question. You have any heuristics for evaluating those predictions or concerns?
I don't have any heuristics. I don't have any algorithms. I don't have any techniques. What I would say
is... No guru, no method, no teacher? Yes, I guess.
That's me. I'm not interested in becoming one of those. You won't see a TED Talk from me anytime soon. But if I was to be asked to build a team within one of these big AI companies to explicitly look at the future, what I would deliberately do was either hire people that come from each one of these 4 backgrounds, or make sure we were doing all of this type of work, all 4 of these types of work on a daily basis. So you do need the could futurism. You need to think about the opportunities there from a commercial point of view, but also from a societal and beneficial point of view. What are all the things we could do with this technology? But be aware that it might be biased, or it might be led by things like science fiction and other things. We should also think about should, because every company needs to make a decision. You actually have to do something. So you have to make fair guesses about what you think we should do as an organization. We should look at the economics of what we're doing, the economics of AI and the opportunities there. We should also look at might, which is we should plot 100 different scenarios into the future, and if this, then that, sort of, so that we can understand the territory into which we're treading a bit more, and try to understand all of the different opportunities that might exist in our future, and then try and think about how probable, possible, and plausible those things might be. And then we should also definitely spend a lot of time thinking about thinking about areas where we wouldn't like to end up, things that could go wrong, the externalities and the implications of the things we might be talking about, and really do that with some depth and rigor. And then try and bring all of that together into one sort of big body of work that's well invested, that's taken all the way up to the C-suite, that's presented as a sort of overarching ambition for the organization. And the fact that it's taken me so long to answer your simple question just goes into what I mean when I say rigor. Like, thinking about the future is not a headline, a statistic, a statement about superintelligence. It's deep, meaningful, long-term, involved, rigorous work. And I just don't think there are many companies that are set up to do that or have the inclination to do that. And I actually think that's what we need more than anything.
From what you know of the discussion now, and everyone's saying everything, but what's your assessment of how good a job the important players are doing in those questions?
I think it's a spectrum. I think that I don't want to really drop names because obviously I'm not across everything that they're all doing, and an awful lot is probably still hidden. I think that my honest feeling, hand on heart, is right now, if we're thinking about middle of the bell curve, ordinary, Graham and Margaret living in the Midlands of the UK, what they want to hear are stories about what it's going to mean to them. And I think the company that tells the best stories, the most rigorous, the most believable, the most detailed, the most relatable stories are the ones that are going to actually succeed. And I think that's the key for me.
Okay, last question. I liked Loon. I liked the idea of Loon. I liked how the balloons looked. These were the balloons that were going to give internet access to rural areas by floating in the stratosphere. They look like jellyfish. I was into it. I'm glad you tried. My question is, and I know it's a riff on the word balloon, but why'd you call it Loon?
I didn't call it Loon. It was nothing to do with me. That project was already well underway when I joined Google.
But isn't it? I mean, wasn't it? Well, just as hard as that was going to be, overcoming the name a little bit, made it a little bit harder.
I will put your question to the authorities and see if I get a response.
Yeah, ask them in the HAL 9000 room.
I'll do just that.
Do you agree? Did you say Loon the first time it's pitched to you?
Do you know, I didn't actually. I didn't. I've got to be honest, hand on heart, it never really crossed my mind. But it's everyone has an opinion, and every opinion is valid.
Sure. The name of the book is Could, Should, Might, Don't, How We Think About the Future. Nick Foster is the author. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.